All set.
Okay, thank you. Welcome to today's AIM Center webinar. It is Thursday, May 31st. If you have come in early, you'll see that there's a link here for downloading the materials for today's webinar, both a PowerPoint presentation and a digital handout. And I'll show this again in just a moment. We are closed captioning this webinar. If you don't see the closed caption appear along the bottom of your screen, please click on the closed caption option in the upper right corner of your Zoom window. You should see a call out that says closed caption is available, and then captions will appear along the bottom of your screen. If you need assistance with that, please enter that in the chat, and Leslie will assist you. If you don't know how to use the chat, and if you're not sure if you want to contribute to the conversation today, please do. Please do early and often through the chat area. You can open the chat panel from the upper left corner of your Zoom window, and be sure to choose all panelists and attendees from the drop-down window above the text entry field. So you'll see at the bottom of the chat box, you'll see a prompt type message here. Just above that, you should see a blue oval that gives you a list of recipients of your message. Choose that drop down and make sure that all panelists and attendees is selected. And that way, everybody will see your message. It won't just go to, for example, the panelists. And please tweet out if you are, if you're tweeting today, please tweet out to hashtag AIM #4all. Just another reminder here, if you've just come in the past minute or so, there are materials available at the event page for today's webinar. It's a bit.ly, bit.ly/AEM transition 18. There's also a QR code there for those of you who may be on your phone or a tablet, and you can grab that link through there. There is both the PowerPoint and a digital handout, as I've indicated. The digital handout is very, very helpful. The PowerPoint does not have all of the links and all of the resources listed. The digital handout does. So the digital handout is basically an accessible Word document of the entire PowerPoint presentation. So it has links to all the resources in the context of the slides, and also includes a reference list. So please grab that. The PowerPoint can be helpful because this is open source. It's Creative Commons, so if you want to use this presentation, this PowerPoint in your own professional development, grab the PowerPoint and feel free to adapt it for your setting. The webinar is being recorded, and the link will be available from that same page sometime next week. So today's webinar is AIM and Transition Focused Education Planning. I'm Cynthia Curry. I'm director of the National Center on Accessible Educational Materials. And with me today is our captioner, Cindy. Cindy, thank you for being here and providing the captions. And Leslie O'Callaghan, who's the AIM Center Operations Coordinator. And she is monitoring the chat and will be there for assistance during the presentation. One other comment is that as the presentation goes along, please go ahead and enter your questions and comments in the chat. I will be pausing at certain times during the presentation and asking Leslie if there are any questions. I have my eye on the chat as well, but I may not catch everything. So we will pause at certain times during the presentation, and there'll also be hopefully some time for Q&A at the end. So the idea behind this presentation today, this webinar, is the idea that kids are moving on from K-12 and they're moving into post-secondary settings. And regardless of where they are headed to from K-12, we want to make sure that their learning continues. And that learning can take many different directions. One of them is higher education, and that's going to be the focus today. You may be wondering why the director of the AIM Center is doing a presentation on transition. But it's near and dear to my heart because I started my career in education as a middle school and a high school science teacher. And just before joining CAST in the AIM Center, I was the coordinator of disability services at a small private university. So I've really had the benefit of seeing both sides of the transition bridge, both the process of supporting students in my case, middle school and high school, preparing them, as a general educator, and then also seeing students as they enter post-secondary during that transition from high school and all of the complications and anxieties that come with that. So it's a pleasure for me to put transition in the context of another passion of mine, which is accessible educational materials. So as we begin, I'd like you to have in your mind some students or a particular student that is going through this big leap. Of course, it is graduation time. Here it is May 31st, and some of your, where some of you are located, graduations may already have happened. So maybe there's a particular student you have in mind today. Perhaps there's a group of students. Perhaps you're preparing for next year. This is a fresh start. So if in your setting transition hasn't been a strong focus, perhaps you can be thinking ahead to the students who are coming up. And of course, we need to start way back before students are on the verge of graduation and begin as early as preschool in terms of supporting students and developing the independence and the self-reflection and the self-advocacy that they're going to need once they get to this point where they're taking this leap. So no matter where you are along the continuum of supporting kids as they are transitioning, even from grade to grade, from school to school, and then the big T, which is moving on to post-secondary settings, be having these faces in mind. For the chat, I'd like to know what your role is in transition-focused planning. As people were coming in and introducing themselves, I have a sense of a few people who are here. But if you would let me know two things. One is, from your perspective, the role that you have in supporting transition planning. Are you at pre-K? Are you at elementary school, middle school, high school, or post-secondary? And it doesn't matter what your role is. You could be a parent, you could be a teacher, you could be an occupational therapist, higher ed faculty, a disability services coordinator. What is your role? And at which level do you serve? And of course, there may be multiple. Perhaps you serve multiple roles at multiple levels. So if you'd go ahead and enter that in the chat, I'm going to take a look. So we have a K-12 teacher of the visually impaired, middle school and high school special ed transition coordinator. Thank you so much for being here. And of course, you're all welcome to, and I know that there are a lot of shared passion here in this webinar, so please feel free to enter your own thoughts into the chat as we move along. Okay, great. Post-secondary adjunct faculty, voc evaluator, Career Center for 11th and 12th grade transition to employment, all grades, AIM specialist for the state. Thank you. I recognize Rachel. Assistive technology specialist, K-12. All right, University of Maryland, right, at Baltimore County. Maggie Pick, I'm the AIM coordinator in your district at Cedar Rapids. For the AT specialist, special ed consultant, AT specialist, multiple disabilities at the middle and high school level. Post-secondary education and as a needs assessor, making recommendations for AT. Also train post-16 educators in the UK on inclusive strategies. Great, thank you for being here, Kelly. Everybody, go ahead as we move along and add your own thoughts from your own perspective in addition to any questions that you may have for me. All right, Assistant Director of Special Education in Oklahoma. Great. Thank you. And if you didn't have a chance, please don't hesitate. It's never too late to add something in the chat, who you are, where you're from. In this webinar, we're going to be working backward in the transition process. So we're going to start where we are looking to prepare students to go to, and in this case, first year in higher education. Then we're going to move back to the summary of performance and then into the IEP. And there's a lot of things that go on in between, as the trapeze moves from one to the other. So definitely not going to be a clean categorization of these three areas, but just the idea that we're working backward. We're starting at that first year in higher ed, what students need to be prepared for, and moving backward to what are the implications for that as we're preparing kids in K-12. Some of the topics, the differences between special ed and K-12 and disability services in post-secondary settings. And those differences, although in this particular webinar, we're focusing on higher education rather than workforce development, those differences really apply regardless of the post-secondary setting. Some examples of how learners use accessible educational materials and accessible technologies to meet higher ed requirements, and some strategies for preparing students for this leap into adulthood. Couple of notes, SWD in this presentation stands for Students with Disabilities, and HE stands for Higher Education. So I use those two abbreviations in order to save some space in the PowerPoint slides. So let's first look at the current landscape for students with disabilities and higher ed. In this webinar, what I'm defining as higher ed destinations are 2-year community colleges, 4-year colleges or universities, and career and technical education or CTE programs in some technical college, technical college systems. So just to have a shared understanding of the context for this webinar in terms of transition, this is the destination that I'll be speaking to. It's the one that I am most knowledgeable about. I know we have some workforce development expertise here as well, so feel free to add to this conversation from your perspective through the chat. So some concerning statistics, as again in the higher ed realm, is that in the academic year 2014 to 2015, the high school graduation rate for all students was 83%, whereas for students with disabilities, that rate was 65%. This data is as recent as 2016, the most recent data that we have. So 83% for all students, but only 65% for students with disabilities. A big gap, obviously. For post-secondary outcomes, this is talking about students graduating from high school. Now we're talking about post-secondary outcomes. Students with disabilities enroll in college at half the rate of their peers without disabilities, and they're graduating at a lower rate. Of persons with disabilities 25 years old and greater, about 25% of them have an associate's degree versus 45% of persons without disabilities. About 17% have a bachelor's degree versus about 35% of persons without disabilities. So we're looking at tremendous gaps in the ability to have equal access to employment, competitive salaries as these students are exiting post-secondary if they do graduate. 14% have bachelor's degrees or higher versus 33% of people without disabilities. There are some promising statistics, however. The rate of students with disabilities in post-secondary has almost doubled since 1995, and that may coincide or correlate with the 1990 reauthorization of the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which became IDEA in 1990. But it's almost doubled. In 1995 to 96, it was 6%. And in the 2011-2012 academic year, it was a little over 11%. And of course, there are other things that have been put in place during that time. Of course, RTI, Response to Intervention, was implemented, PBIS, Positive Behavioral Intervention Support. So there are some evidence-based research-associated strategies that have also been put in place in that time. So we know that it's making a difference. And I found it interesting to break down the percentages of where those students who are going on to post-secondary, where they're going. So 44% are enrolling in 2-year or community colleges, 32% in career technical education schools, and 19% of those students are enrolling in 4-year schools. The promise of transition planning can't be denied. So we saw some concerning statistics, some promising statistics, and how can we build on that to ensure that those promising statistics continue to build and outweigh. The concerning is that we know that transition planning works. There's research that shows that it does. So it's not something just instinctually that we can say, well, it makes sense to prepare students for life beyond high school. When it's done well, it actually really does make a difference for these kids. So research has shown that for students with disabilities who receive effective transition planning services in high school and attend higher ed institutions, they're more likely to self-disclose their disability earlier. They have higher grade point averages. They earn credits by their sophomore year, which is really important. A lot of times students with disabilities, or many students in general, will come into higher ed and they'll be shortened on credits because they need to take remedial courses, which they don't earn credit for. The receiving disability-specific supports, they're more likely to do that, to request and receive those supports. And interestingly, they're also more likely to access supports that are available to all students. Most campuses have a tutoring service, or they have a study center where there are tutors and people who have supports for certain classes. And students with disabilities who have had transition support are more likely to access those, as well as some of the peers. And a lot of campuses, it's the smartest, it's the most, it's the most motivated students that are using the campus. Sometimes it's called the Academic Success Center. And we need more students taking advantage of those supports, and they need to be prepared to do that. So from your point of view, in your setting or in general, are students being effectively prepared for post-secondary, somewhat prepared, or not prepared at all? And this could be true for either higher ed or moving on to workforce. Whatever plan is been determined to be jointly with the student that has been most likely determined to be a successful post-high school experience for them. Are they being effectively prepared, somewhat prepared, or not prepared at all for those settings? So somewhat. All right, depends on the disability. That's very interesting. You might say, for what disability are students being most successfully prepared? All right, it looks like it's mostly somewhat. Peer transition vary tremendously depending on the disability. All right, for visually impaired, all right, not really. Very interesting. So keep those comments coming in. So what are some of the factors that are contributing to the challenges of the first year? What's getting in the way of students being able to enter and complete higher education? So of course, we know there are legislation differences. K-12 laws differ from post-secondary. So in K-12, the laws are the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and Section 504 of the Rehab Act. Whereas in post-secondary, the laws that apply are the Americans with Disabilities Act, as amended in 2008, which there are some really important implications of that 2000 amendment for post-secondary, which I'll speak to, and Section 504. So Section 504 applies to both. Of course, that's the anti-discrimination law of the land. So let's look at the IDEA versus the ADA. The ADA is the nation's K-12 special education law, covers kids from infancy through high school graduation or age 21, depending on when they are exiting. IDA requires schools to serve the educational needs of eligible students with disabilities, requires them to find and evaluate students suspected of having disabilities, and of course at no cost to families, also guarantees the free appropriate public education, FAPE, for students with disabilities in the least restrictive environment. So FAPE and LRE, an individual education program, fall under IDEA. So all of those supports under special education law, under IDEA. Of course, when students move on to post-secondary, IDEA no longer applies. Those supports are no longer provided to them, because the ADA simply requires, and this isn't simply, but is much less comprehensive than what students are guaranteed in K-12. But the ADA requires higher ed institutions to provide students with disabilities with accommodations that are necessary to afford the student with the disability an equal opportunity to participate in the institution's programs. And there are two titles that apply to ADA, which is important to know, is that both public and private institutions fall under the ADA. So Title II covers state and local government, so that's your public universities and community colleges. Title III covers public accommodations, so that's your private colleges and universities. So anywhere your students are going to higher ed, they're covered under ADA. The important distinction between these two laws is that in K-12, the focus is on student progress and success, whereas as students enter higher ed and they are covered under ADA, it's just equal access. There's no focus on ensuring that students are making progress or they're succeeding. So there are no supports in place under the ADA for things like tutoring, intervention supports, life skills supports. ADA is purely the role of a disability services personnel to identify what is the functional limitation that the student experiences in the learning setting, and what is the accommodation that can help address that. I see some comments coming in. I'm going to just finish this section and I'll take a look. There's also a shift in responsibility from the team to the student. So in K-12, there's an adult team that's responsible for developing the program that ensures student progress or success. In post-secondary, of course, the shift is toward the student. Then the student is now responsible for requesting and using accommodations for equal access. So they're not requesting supports that will help them succeed. They are requesting supports that will allow them to have equal access to the same curriculum and the same benefits that all students have. Some of those responsibilities that fall on them, of course, they need to voluntarily self-disclose their disability to the disability support services. Increasingly on campuses, disability support or the Office of Support or the Office for Students with Disabilities is being replaced by accessibility. So in some cases, it's the Office for Accessibility or Access. That D word, disability, increasingly is being replaced with the A word, accessibility. So students need to be prepared to be looking for either title. They need to request accommodations upon self-disclosing their disability, and they need to be prepared to participate in an interactive process to determine the reasonable accommodations that they need, which of course can be very intimidating to what essentially are still teenagers, young adults. They need to be able to provide documentation of their disability, and they need to meet with the personnel to discuss their requests for accommodations and their associated documentation. So they need to be able to have a knowledgeable discussion about what their history of accommodations has been, why those accommodations were needed. Very helpful if they're well versed in their documentation so that they can speak to those accommodations and why they were important. So this is part of the student responsibility in higher ed. And of course, parents are part of this as well, but it's going to be most successful when students can speak for themselves. Nobody should replace the student voice in this process. The parent role or the guardian role really should be one of support and helping the student to prepare for these conversations and for this process. Some of the barriers that are research-based that students experience, so these are real barriers. They're not just suspected barriers, but all of them really make sense. Some things that get in the way of students seeking and using accommodations, because getting the accommodation is just the first step. Using them is the second step. So lack of self-advocacy skills, the belief that services aren't needed. I've graduated from high school, so I've conquered learning. I no longer need them. So there's lack of understanding that these accommodations are in place for a reason. Their desire for self-sufficiency that is linked to that. The desire to avoid negative social reactions, which in some settings, in some institutions, it's difficult for students to keep their accommodations private, depending on how the accommodations are provided. Insufficient knowledge about the services that are available on campus. Fear of future ramifications. So some students they're fearful that if they use their accommodations that there will be some kind of a flag on their transcript, and they need to know that that's not true. the quality and usefulness of the Disability Services Office, and the accommodations that they're provided. And of course, that's a very detrimental situation when a student who needs accommodations isn't effectively provided with them. And then, of course, negative experiences with faculty. That too is real, and we need to make sure that students are prepared to manage that. So I'm going to take a moment and just look at some of the questions that have come in and the comments just really briefly. I'm of the opinion that most of the students fail to understand that the student should and must play an active role in transition. Absolutely. When we get to the recommendations, that will certainly be highlighted. Talking about the role of the TVI, carrying the message that the student must know that their IP ends at high school graduation. Most of the team sits around the table and looks at other participants as though it's somebody else's responsibility. Very unfortunate. Janet, this is excellent. Why the need for students to access general ed supports, disability services is access, but other services are for help to succeed. All right, welcome from Chile. And then cultivating purposeful and motivated learners is essential and should be reinforced by teachers as a learning goal. I love that it's something that's explicit and is a learning goal. It's not a soft skill. This is something that students are essential to their success. So let's move into the role of accessible materials and technologies. So the first part is just the argument why transition services are so important. I know many of you know this, but hopefully this presentation gives you some more resources in order to take back to your schools to make these arguments. What is the role of accessible materials and technologies in all of this? Because when students use AEM and the accessible technologies in K-12, they're gonna continue to need them. So there's a functional definition of accessible that's really helpful to use as a framework when making the argument that students need accessible educational materials. So this comes from the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. And accessible means that an individual person with a disability is afforded the same opportunity, or is afforded the opportunity to acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as a person without a disability in an equally effective, equally integrated manner with substantially equivalent ease of use as a person without a disability. So this definition comes from 2013. I'm sure it appeared in other documentation before that, but it's in a resolution agreement with South Carolina Technical College System. This is one of the ways that the Office for Civil Rights communicates to mostly in higher ed institutions, although we do know that there's increasingly some complaints being lodged against K-12 schools, particularly their website not being in compliance with web accessibility. But this definition is really important. It gives you a framework. This is the bar for accessibility. And the Office for Civil Rights goes on to say that this might not result in identical ease of use, but whatever the technology, the material that is chosen for a student with a disability must ensure equal opportunity. Also says to the educational benefits and opportunities afforded by the technology and equal treatment in the use of such technology. So it's a high bar. Something accessible doesn't necessarily need to be the same as material technology used by other students, but it needs to be equally effective, equally integrated, and the student needs to be able to use it with substantially the same ease of use as the material technology that other students are using. So it needs to be seamless. And Cassie, make sure your comments are shared with everyone. Oh, thank you, Cassie. So a comment just came in. Some people may have come in a little bit late to the webinar. Unfortunately, a little glitch in Zoom is when you are entering a message into the chat area. You need to make sure the blue box just above where you enter, where you type your message, there's a drop down on that blue box. Please make sure that you are choosing all panelists and attendees. So if you came in late, it's not too late to choose that. Thank you, Cassie, for bringing that up. I'll continue to read the comments as well as I have the opportunity. So how does this relate to materials and technologies? It's really important to understand the distinction between a material and a technology in addition to what accessible means, because in order for students to have full access, both need to be accessible. So the technical aspect of this is really critical. A material is the information or the content that delivers the information to the student. So it's the ebook, it's the website, it's the simulation, it's the content of the curriculum. And it's accessible when it's designed or enhanced in a way that makes it usable by the widest possible range of learner variability, regardless of the format. So whether it's in print, digital, graphical, audio, video, all of that can be made accessible for students with disabilities. And of course, I think most people here know that there are some significant considerations that need to be made in the design of the material from the start to avoid retrofitting, but all of those can be made accessible. And then a technology is the hardware or the software that delivers that content, delivers the material. So things like tablets, learning management systems, computers, smartphones. So that's the technology, it's the delivery system of the material. It's accessible when it's usable by people with a wide range of abilities and disabilities. And it's also accessible when it's directly usable without assistive technology or usable with it. So even if a technology isn't inherently accessible for a student, for example, with blindness or low vision, perhaps that student uses a refreshable braille display. If the technology is compatible with that, so for example, perhaps it's a Bluetooth refreshable braille display, if that technology is Bluetooth enabled, then the technology is accessible because it does allow the use of assistive technology with it. Yes, sounds like the definition of universal design. A lot of crossover. Here's an example. This is what I call material, technology, and accessible harmony. There's a figure here of an individual reading an ebook on a tablet. And there's harmony, accessible harmony going on there. When the ebook is accessible, the tablet is accessible. And some examples that make that tablet accessible is it has some built-in options for access, such as a screen reader for students who are blind or have low vision, text-to-speech that's very useful to students with learning disabilities, ADHD, display customization, so it can be black on white, white on black, that there can be more white space added, some other color contrasts are options. It's Bluetooth enabled, like the example I just gave with the refreshable braille display. Closed captions can be turned on, as well as video description. And that tablet is also compatible with students' assistive technology, which I'll have another example of that in just a moment. And of course, speaking of universal design, all of this is useful for all students. So when a technology and a material are made to be accessible, just opens up opportunities, options, choices for all users of that material technology combination. Justin mentioned alt text. Yes, so if the material supports alt text, those images can be deciphered by a screen reader. Screen reader users will know what that image is trying to convey. So here's that interoperability. That technology is a demonstration of how that tablet can be made compatible with an assistive technology device. So in this case, this is known as Access. It's the Access for Kids switch. It is through Georgia Tech. And I have a little bit more information about it here. In the digital handout, there's a link to this video that you can watch. It's very brief. I think you see it's under a minute long, but it's a great example of how a tablet is made interoperable, making the technology and the material accessible. So for this to work, for this AT to operate, the material on that tablet needs to be accessible and the tablet needs to be interoperable with the assistive technology that the student is using. So the student is sitting at a table, and she has what's known as a pressure switch. It's 3 consecutive switches on her forearm. and it's connected wirelessly to a tablet, and it's a pressure switch. So in a situation where a student doesn't have the fine motor skills to swipe, to pinch, to do your various gestures, they can use any voluntary movement and activate their tablet using this pressure switch. So in this image, the student is using her fist, but a student could use, they could use an elbow, they could use a foot. This switch could be placed on a wheelchair, and it could be activated with head movements. So this is an example, another example of, in this case, material technology, assistive technology harmony. So we know that this access is possible, that learning materials and technologies can be available to all students to have the same opportunities for learning. Some of the AIM-related post-secondary accommodations, because all of this carries over to post-secondary. Alternative formats of printed textbooks and inaccessible digital materials. That's a common accommodation in higher ed. It's also known as the alternative format accommodation. Use of assistive technology, extended time on exams, very common. Note-taking services are also common, audio recording of lectures. So these are just some of the standard, very common accommodations in post-secondary. The availability of them doesn't necessarily mean that a student who is coming from K-12 having had an IEP or a 504 plan will be provided with these accommodations, or those accommodations will be approved for them, but they are very common. And teachers and students, parents need to know that students have this opportunity to continue with the accommodations that they need. Oftentimes, I think adults make the mistake of taking the accommodations away from students, thinking that it's going to interfere with their learning, that they're not going to be able to, they're not going to have access to these accommodations when they go into post-secondary. But under the Americans with Disabilities Act, they absolutely are covered, as long as they are prepared to have the documentation and be able to articulate why they need these accommodations, which we are working our way to some strategies to make sure that happens. Some of the accessibility tools that increase student independence in higher ed, these are some things that students can start using in K-12 because they can easily transition with them into higher ed, in many cases minimizing or taking away the need for the student to have an accommodation in certain, for certain purposes if they have these tools available to them and they're proficient in them by the time they get into college or any higher ed setting. So accessible digital versions of textbooks and course materials at commercial sources. So when I was a disability services coordinator, I absolutely encourage students, go to Amazon, see if your textbook is there in a format that you need. Audible, human narrated books, Vital Source. I encourage transition teams to look up some of these commercial sources of books, see what's there to make sure that you convince yourself and students that they do have quite a variety of higher ed textbooks available there. And also the college bookstore will have digital versions of textbooks. Not all of them are going to be accessible to all students. It depends on what the student's needs are and if the ebook reader has the supports that the student needs. But in my experience, a lot of the books that are available commercially, digital books that are available commercially, do have the built-in supports that a lot of students need. So it's worth exploring before students move on to higher ed. And of course, their membership services for Bookshare and Learning Ally, those are also available in higher ed. Bookshare is a free service, so if students leave high school with their individual membership, they're set to go when they get into college to use that independently. Learning Ally is fee-based for human narrated audio books. They do have a lot of post-secondary books, as does Bookshare, but Learning Ally, there's a fee. And not all higher ed institutions will have memberships to Learning Ally, but individual students can. Text-to-speech, of course, if students are proficient in using text-to-speech, knowing how to turn that on in various devices, in various materials, they can find their way to where the text-to-speech can be activated, all the better. Optical character recognition apps, which are apps on a smartphone or a tablet where students can take a picture of a standard print material, converts it into digital text with a text-to-speech reader. audio recording apps, smart pens, note-taking apps. All of these are available to students to start learning how to use independently. There is a cost associated with them if they're going to bring these tools with them into higher ed, but of course, in many cases, very much worth it. So where does accessible materials and technologies, where do they fall in the transition process? And I'm just going to take a gander over here at the chat to see what may have come in, because I'm doing pretty well on time. All right, thank you. Okay, yeah, so Leslie's been busy putting links into the chat. Thank you, Leslie. And also remember, if you came in late, there's a digital handout for this webinar that I highly recommend that you download. Has links to all of the resources and a reference list within the context of each of the slides. Cassie, requesting captioning for videos, learning to read transcripts, CART, type well, excellent examples of accommodations. Justin uses the Bookshare web reader. Excellent, and of course that is, having Bookshare is a free membership for folks who aren't familiar with Bookshare by chance. Bookshare is at bookshare.org, and it's a membership. Students need to qualify for sources of materials that are in Bookshare, but really worthwhile looking into it for students who have learning disabilities, physical disabilities, blindness, and low vision. If your teams aren't familiar with or considering Bookshare for students, please be sure that you investigate that. And you can also always contact the AEM Center for support. So where does AEM happen in the transition planning process? So before talking about that, let's just get a handle on transition itself as a planning process. So here's a timeline of the transition requirements as they unrolled in IDEA. So of course, IDEA was the Education for All Handicapped Children Act when it was introduced in 1975. In 1990, when the title changed to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, when that replaced the EAHCA, transition planning was required for students with disabilities beginning at age 16. In 1997, the transition planning requirement was expected to begin at the age of 14 with a statement regarding course of study, and at or before age 16 with a statement regarding the needed services, including outside agencies. And then in 2004, the requirement of the summary of performance was added. So you can see over time, the IDEA has not been reauthorized since 2004, which I don't need to tell anybody here, but that is, it'll be interesting when we know the IDEA will be reauthorized again. What will be the additional, what have we learned about the importance of transition that will build on the incremental emphasis of the transition planning being part of the IEP process? The basic definition of transition planning as it's stated in IDEA, so this is really the floor of transition planning, is that it's a coordinated set of activities for a child with a disability. It's results-oriented. It's based on individual needs, taking into account the strengths, preferences, and interests of that student. And it includes instruction-related services, community experiences, employment, et cetera. Anything that's going to be relevant for the setting in which the student is being prepared to enter after high school. So that's the IDEA definition, but it's really, like I said, it's the floor. If we really want to think about transition being a robust process, we'll look at the definition as it is laid out under the term transition-focused education. And this is from Kohler and Field. It's a 2003 article, and you'll find it in the digital handout. And I wouldn't be surprised if Leslie was putting it, I think it's a citation. I don't think that there's a link to this one in the digital handout. I have links where you'll be taken to the articles that are available online. In some cases, you'll have to get them through a library database. Really worthwhile to read this article. In this definition, transition planning is a fundamental basis of education. It guides the development of all educational programs, including strategies that keep students in school. So it's a retention strategy. It's not an add-on activity for students with disabilities. It's not something that happens on the side or even parallel. It's actually embedded in their programming, and it's based on abilities, options, and self-determination, which is a little bit different than the floor definition of transition. And a quote that I pulled from the article is that transition-focused education is a shift from disability-focused, deficit-driven programs to an education and service delivery approach based on abilities, options, and self-determination. So much more robust interpretation of the transition planning process. Some resources to support this, again, are provided in the digital handout. If you want to go directly to it, of course, there's always Google. But if you use the digital handout, it'll be a little bit more efficient. But this, the transition-focused education, this is the taxonomy for transition programming 2.0, and it was written. This is from again the author of the article, Transition-Focused Education, that I just referred to in the previous slide, with some other co-authors. It's a group of academics, but with some research that has gone on within K-12 schools. This is an image of the taxonomy for transition programming. It is it's a cycle diagram. It's sort of a flow chart of a circle with each of the components of the transition-focused education programming placed at various locations along this circle. So these include student-focused planning is one of the components, student development, so that would include things like student supports, interagency collaboration, which we know very commonly lacks in transition planning, family engagement, so things like the cultural relevance for families is really important. Families understanding transition as empowerment, that they have a role, that their children have a role in this. And program structure, of course, includes things like the school climate, which we don't always realize how impactful the climate is. And of course, through all of these is the role of the student, and the student being empowered, the student having some self-direction and some choice in the whole transition, the transition process. The summary of performance and the IEP, remembering that we're going backward, that the summary of performance is part of the transition planning process. And when you look back at the definition for the summary of performance and transition, of course, there's a distinction with the summary of performance because it needs to be completed during the final year of high school. But the summary of performance can be started way before that. So the summary of performance should be something that the transition team has in mind along the IEP process. So even though it doesn't need to be completed until the final year of high school, that doesn't mean that it gets started at the student's final IEP meeting before they exit high school. So the summary of performance, the way it's defined, if this is your the first time knowing about the summary of performance, also known, you'll often hear of it referred to just as SOP. It's for a child whose eligibility under special ed terminates due to graduation with a regular diploma or due to exceeding the age of eligibility, 21. The local education agency shall provide the child with a summary of the child's academic achievement, functional performance, which shall include recommendations on how to assist the child in meeting the child's post-secondary goals. And there are some supports for this. So there's a nationally endorsed summary of performance template, again, that is available through the digital handout. This was developed as a collaboration among multiple experts. Again, many of them are in academics, but many of the organizations that worked on this template also represent and are from K-12 environments, as well as those who are familiar with the environments in which students are going to be entering upon exiting high school. So some of the organizations that were involved in this template, the Association on Higher Education and Disability, the Council for Exceptional Children, the National Center on Learning Disabilities, and the Higher Education Consortium for Special Education. So those are just a few, because I wanted to give you an idea of the credibility of this template and why it's worth seeking out and bringing it back to your teams. and taking a look at it. If you're not already using a summary of performance for students, which I know many schools are not, start with this one if you haven't already. If you already have a summary of performance template that you're using, check out the nationally endorsed and see if there are some ways that you can strengthen the template that you're currently using. The sections of the template, there are 5 of them. There's a background section, post-secondary goals, the summary of performance, recommendations, and student input. So when you're thinking about where does accessible education materials and technologies fit, look at the sections 3, 4, and 5, summary of performance, recommendations, and student input. These are the 3 places that have the most relevance for including students' needs for accessible materials and technologies. So here is, I know it's hard to see, so go download that template so you can take a closer look. But this is the summary of performance for the academic area. In that first column, there are content areas of reading, math, written language, learning skills. Then there's the second column is to report present level of performance. And then the third column are the essential accommodations, the assistive technology modifications that have been used in high school and why they're needed. So when it comes time to consider the role of accessible materials and technologies, some things that you might think about including in that essential accommodations column would be things like use of text-to-speech tools, speech recognition, the need for books provided in specialized formats, accessible formats of classroom materials, audio recording of class lectures, use of digital study skills tools. So make sure that anything that the student is using for academic access and success in K-12, because in K-12 success does fall under IDEA. In the ADA, in higher ed, success does not. So everything needs to be placed in the context of need. Why does the student need these as they move on into higher ed for equal access? Section 4 is recommendations. On here, suggestions for accommodations, adapted devices, assistive services, etc. There are 4 rows. There's a higher education or career technical education, employment, independent living, community participation. In this area, be as specific as possible about the accessible materials and technologies, those accommodations that the student will need. Based on in what setting are they moving on to, and think about the individuals that are going to be receiving this summary of performance. What do they need to know about the student's need for AIM-related accommodations in any number of settings? Then, of course, there's the student input. This is so important. The student input section of the summary of performance. This gives the student an opportunity to speak for themselves. Really great practice for them to prepare themselves for having a verbal conversation with the person receiving this summary of performance. So the prompt here is in the past, what supports have been tried by teachers or by you to help you succeed in schools, such as aids, adaptive equipment, physical accommodations, other services, and then which of these accommodations and supports has worked best for you. So that's the role for, of course, the student has a role in all of these sections. This is where they really need to make sure that they have their reasons for their need for AIM and accessible technologies and assistive technologies, gives them an opportunity to lay that out in a coherent, comprehensive narrative that they can then apply when they are having verbal conversations in person to advocate for themselves. Another resource for the summary of performance that pulls all of this together is the Ohio packet. It has Ohio summary of performance form, has guidance for completing the form, has a sample cover letter and some resources. And that sample cover letter is really a gem. It's a cover letter for the student to prepare to accompany the summary of performance. So it has sections for the student to talk about their background information, the information on the diagnosis of their disability, the services supports that they've received from agencies outside of their school, their post-secondary goals that are wide-ranging, summary of their high school academic achievement, functional performance, their essential accommodations, modifications, and assistive technologies that I've used in high school, recommendations from high school professionals, based on the regarding the supports and accommodations that may enhance my access to post-school settings, and my perceptions of my disability, what works best for me, and accommodations that may be addressed in post-school settings. So that sample cover letter really is a great benefit of this packet in and of itself. There's nothing else that you grab from this packet. That sample cover letter can be really powerful. Where AIM falls in the IEP, of course, as you can imagine, we're close to the end of time, so I didn't even go down the road of talking about the IEP. I've chosen to let Joy Zabala and Diana Carl do that for me. They just gave a webinar on this topic on May 1st, and the recording and the associated materials are available in the digital handout. I'm not sure whether Leslie is grabbing that or not, but it's in the digital handout. They talk about where do accessible materials and technologies fit in the IEP, keeping in mind when you're watching that webinar, what are the implications for the transition plan? What is it, as you're thinking about where these pieces go in the IEP, in the context of the goals of the student and their objectives, how does this relate to their post-high school experiences? So some final recommendations. Set high expectations and provide accessible materials to reach them. So in many cases, we do put high expectations on students, but then we don't give them the supports to succeed and they fail. So they need to have the supports to reach those high expectations. They need both. So ensure IP goals are aligned with the challenging academic content standards, aligned to the grade that the student is in. And just a couple of research findings here. Students with disabilities who took rigorous high school academic courses were more likely to enroll in college, earned more college credits, had higher college GPAs, were more likely to earn a bachelor's degree. And those students with disabilities who took more general ed classes were more likely to be actively involved in their transition planning. That's cited Newman et al. 2016. That's in the digital handout. So do that and provide students with the AIM and accessible technologies they need to reach those high expectations. Give students a record of their AIM use. Many institutions don't accept an IEP as a form of documentation. In the 2008 amendments to the ADA, there is some language that IEPs should be considered as documentation for higher ed, but many institutions are in transition on that. So make the students' need for AIM explicit in the IEP and in the summary of performance. Because you want to make sure that students have that, as additional documentation. Explain documentation to students. Make sure that they know about their scores and the impact of the functional impact of their disability on their performance. So whether it's a neuropsych or psychoeducational evaluation, whether it's doctor's records, whatever it is that a student's going to need accommodations for, whatever is the evidence for that, make sure that they understand it. Provide lots of opportunities to use accessible materials. So when they get to higher ed, they're going to have a lot of different materials coming at them, a lot of different technologies, and the better they are prepared to cope with those, with the various materials and technologies they're going to be asked to use, the better prepared they are in K-12, the more likely they are to succeed. So give them opportunities to use accessible materials and technologies across purposes, content areas, environments, and various technologies and various materials. Of course, give them an active role in AIM-related decisions, so make sure that they have an opportunity to try various formats and various features. Let them take some risks. Don't penalize them if they're trying a new format and only to realize, gosh, that I wasn't able to learn that through that format, but I tried. Make sure they have input on their goals, their services. Make sure they're empowered to self-evaluate and communicate effectiveness over time. They need to be able to say, is this working for me or is it not? They need to be able to do that in K-12 because with support, because when they get into higher ed, they're going to need to do that independently. And of course, actively contribute to their transition plans. Teach self-determination. It needs to be explicit, regardless of whether a student is in preschool or just about to graduate from high school. There are explicit strategies along the way to make sure that they are growing and that they are actively able to demonstrate how they can show their self-determination. Foster family engagement. Parents need to be prepared as their children are, in order to make sure that they're supporting them appropriately, both to be actively supportive and also to know when they need to back off and why they need to back off, and let their child really steer this process. So in conclusion, I just grabbed this quote from Kohler and Field. Transition to adult roles is a complex process all youth must negotiate, and that a myriad of factors work together to influence students' lives after school completion. So in other words, it's really complex, but so important and so rewarding when it's done right. Here's my contact information, ccurry@cas.org. And I'm going to take a look at the some comments that have come in the chat. And I'm sure we're pretty close. We are at 3 o'clock. So I will take some questions and comments that have come up in the chat. If you need to leave, there is the link to the survey on your screen, and I think that Leslie has also dropped that in the chat. So I'm going to take a look for anybody who wants to stay for a few minutes. I'm going to take a look at some of the comments that have come up in the chat. Let me pick up where I left off. All right, Debbie said the link doesn't work to the, okay, it looks like, Debbie, if you're still here, it looks like you're just missing an L at the end of that link.
Yeah, I responded to her.
Oh, great, thank you. Oh, you know what? I'll just skip over those then. So we use, Steve Beckner, we use the taxonomy with our regular transition teams for planning their activities at the annual Oklahoma Transition Institute. That's great to know. It's always good when sharing resources to know that others have had success with them. All right, Steve Beckner also adds, agrees strongly that the summary of performance can be an ongoing living document addressed at the annual IEP meeting throughout high school. Students often have different teachers or case managers throughout high school, so the senior year teacher may not be aware of many of the transition-related activities the student may have participated in. And this is such a great point that the documentation needs to go with the student, and if the professionals are doing a good job at the elementary, at the middle level, as the student transitions to high school and then on to college, you can see how the documentation, as it travels with the student, really informs the receiver of that student as they cross these bridges across the the lowercase t's, the small t's, and the big T, where they leave us, they leave the protection of IDEA and they move on to the protection of the ADA. All right, and it looks like, other than some thanks, that's it. So really appreciate your time today. Remember that the AIM Center is here to provide technical assistance on transition and whatever other supports you may need. And we really appreciate that you were here today. Thank you to Leslie for monitoring the chat. Thank you to Cindy for your captioning service. I hope everybody has a great rest of your day.
Hi, this message is to Shirley. Shirley, if you just send me an email at locallahan@cas.org, I can send you a certificate. I'm sorry, Shirley. I think I called you Shelley. First day back after vacation. I apologize. Have a great day, everyone.
I think you did call her Shirley, Leslie. I think you're good.
Fabulous. Okay, I'm going to end the recording now, if that's all right.
That's great. Thank you.